Now, one question I have asked myself over the last 20 years, and I know a lot of people have asked, is the Message Bible, is it good or is it bad? Because it's divided. My name is Craig and this is Morning Star Quest, where we are on a journey through the Bible. So is the message good or bad? So let's get under the hood, because I'm going to do a road test. Now, I have been road testing the message for the last 20 years and I want to show you and tell you how it went. Okay, let's get under the hood. Now, Eugene H. Peterson, he wrote the message back in 93. He was asked in 1990 to write a Bible version of the way he talks in his sermons, because he had a way of translating it, like, say, King James, into more modern speak for people today or then. So who's the focus for this? Eugene said that he was a biblical scholar in colleges, and everybody that he met was so interested in the Bible, they wanted to take it apart and try and work out every detail. But then he ended up in a congregation and everybody was, we don't read the Bible because it's too hard, or they just weren't interested because television and movies was way more interesting. He wanted to bridge that gap, and I think he has done that. Most of us received an email, a letter or a note from a friend. A lot of times when we receive one, we can't wait to see what the reader has to say. We open it up and we see the emotion and the thought and the author of the letters has poured into it. It's the same thing with the Bible. It's just that the person behind each note is God, and the notes aren't only about God, they're also about who we are. As he found people in his congregation just weren't reading the Bible to put it into the ears of how someone would listen to the radio, to the television. So let's get into the suspension of how it rides with the reader. Now, one thing I have found is that it is very smooth. It is very easy to read. However, I do feel like there are some rocks along the way. And so when you're reading, there are some verses that, even though it should be clear, kind of just take you a little bit off the path because of the paraphrase, and it's not as word for word accurate or even thought for thought accurate. Let's go over a few verses that will show some good and some bad lights on, the message and how it all fits together. So we got Matthew 6:34, NIV version. Therefore, do not worry about tomorrow, for tomorrow will worry about itself. Each day has enough trouble of its own. So let's do the message. Give your entire attention to what God is doing right now, and don't get worked up about what may or may not happen tomorrow. God will help you deal with whatever hard things come up when the time comes. And it's just giving us more focus on God. This is saying give your entire attention to what God is doing right now. And then we have Romans 12:1, which is talking about sacrifice. But what can we do? So the King James Version, I beseech you, therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that ye present your bodies a living sacrifice, holy, acceptable unto God, which is your reasonable service. Now it does say it, but if someone is reading this for the first time, they might think, well, what is that sacrifice? And I'll skip the NIV because you can see it right there, but the message. So here's what I want you to do. God helping you take your everyday, ordinary life, your sleeping, eating, going to work and walking around life, and place it before God as an offering. It is the same message, but just a little bit deeper. And this is going to take us to the next level of some negatives, which we come to Isaiah 53:5. Again, NIV, but he was pierced for our transgressions and he was crushed for our iniquities. And then we go to the message. But it was our sins that did that to him, that ripped and tore and crushed him, our sins. He took the punishment that made us whole. Through his bruises we get healed. The message is trying to give you a more vivid and imaginative way of understanding this text, but it is just taking that prophetic message out of that text a little bit. Now this one here, John 1:14, King James, and the word was made flesh and dwelt among us. The NIV, the Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. The Message, the Word became flesh and blood and moved into the neighbourhood, dwelt among us, and dwelling among us is inside us. But in the neighbourhood, I'm in the neighbourhood, but I'm not part of it. It doesn't give the reverence it deserves, I think. After reading it, I didn't pick this up, but when my wife was reading it, she said that Jesus does sound a little passive-aggressive. And then when I got out the New International Version, it was very clear that it's not passive-aggressive. But I think when it comes to the suspension of this Bible, it's not to take everything so literally, because it's a paraphrase. It is not word for word or even thought for thought. But with paraphrase, you've got to remember, it does take you away from the original meaning. So I think that it needs a little bit more guidance. So let's go into navigation. The beginning of the book is a must to read because I guess it gives you the understanding, the knowledge of why this translation exists, and it gives you a little bit of background to kind of understand where Eugene is coming from so that we can get into it. But it's not meant to be read as a traditional Bible. I mean, just look at the way it's formatted here. It reads more like a book. It doesn't have the double columns, it's just the single columns. All the verse numbers have been taken out, so it does read like a book. And I think Eugene's thought process here is that it should read more like a story, not like a textbook. The other thing to remember is this is written by one man. And yes, it is reviewed by some peers, I think about 22 other people, if not more. But it's still one man's view to try and get what he feels is the text. And so the navigation kind of leans towards what his thinking is, whether that's good or bad, but it's not neutral. The one thing I have found is that's a little confusing is on the sides, all the different verses and numbers, they're jumbled together. Why is this? Because some of the paraphrases that he goes into, he kind of, instead of one verse paraphrase, he might paraphrase a whole paragraph, which can skip out some verses or some detail. And if you're trying to follow through on a different book, like say the NIV, you will get a little bit confused of where to start, where things stop. And I really do think you do need to have another Bible like the NIV or even King James to kind of balance between, which then the navigation gets a little tricky. Which brings us to interior comfort. The wording that is used is very 1990s, which is very interesting because it feels very outdated. The builders are pooped and the rubbish piles up. It doesn't feel like the Bible. And then if we go to King James, and Judas said, the strength of the bearers of burdens is decayed, and there is much rubbish. The builders are pooped, the rubbish piles up. It doesn't necessarily feel quite right, but it still captures what it needs to say, but for modern ears. Which brings me to the sound system. So if we go to John 1, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. So if we go to John 1 for the Message, the Word was first, the Word present to God, God present to the Word was God, in readiness for God from day one. In a lot of ways, mainly because I probably heard the original NIV version, which I just read first. I know that. It's a very well-known one. I would read this and I think, I don't know, I don't understand it. I kept coming up to questions. Why is that? It doesn't resolve the questions. It just helps you get into it in the first place to then ask the questions. Then get a study Bible and get further into it. I think if that is the whole focus of this Bible, then it's job well done. Now, have I found the perfect Bible for you that just fits every bill? That's this one here. Click on it, you'll love it. Go do something else and forgot, and I'll catch you in the next one.